Right now, as you're watching this video, diplomatic negotiations are happening in the Middle East. Peace talks, treaty discussions, alliance formations, world leaders working behind closed doors on agreements that could reshape the entire region. And biblical prophecy scholars are watching these developments very closely. Not because they oppose peace, but because the Bible predicts a very specific peace agreement marking the beginning of the end times, a treaty lasting exactly 7 years, made with Israel, involving multiple nations, and broken at the 3.5-year midpoint. This isn't modern speculation or conspiracy theory. This is a biblical prophecy that has been carefully studied for over 2 millennia. The prophet Daniel described this treaty in the 6th century BC with remarkable specificity. Today, we're exploring what the Bible actually says about this 7-year peace treaty. What makes it different from every other peace agreement? What signs should we be looking for? And why is this treaty so significant? The 7-year peace treaty isn't just another prophecy buried in ancient scripture. It's considered by many biblical scholars to be the single most identifiable marker of the end times. A clear, unmistakable sign that the final countdown has begun. But here's what makes this topic so challenging. Over the past century, nearly every significant Middle East peace agreement has been examined, analyzed, and debated as potentially being the one. And so far, none of them have qualified. So let's establish a foundation for our discussion today. We're going to look at what the Bible actually says about this treaty. Not what popular prophecy teachers speculate, not what sensational headlines claim, but what Scripture, in its original context, reveals about this pivotal agreement. The primary passage comes from the book of Daniel, chapter 9, verses 24 through 27. This section is known as Daniel's prophecy of the 70 weeks. It's one of the most studied prophetic passages in all of Scripture, and it contains specific details about a 7-year covenant that will be confirmed with Israel. Now, before we dive into the specifics, we need to understand why this matters. This isn't just an interesting theological puzzle. According to biblical prophecy, this treaty marks the beginning of what's called the Tribulation period, a 7-year span of time that precedes the second coming of Jesus Christ. Understanding this treaty helps us understand the prophetic timeline. It helps us recognize the season we're in. And it equips us to interpret current events through a biblical lens rather than through fear or speculation. Today, we're going to explore 4 key aspects. First, what the Bible specifically says about this treaty. Second, what criteria would need to be met for a treaty to qualify. Third, why previous peace agreements haven't fulfilled the prophecy. And fourth, what current geopolitical developments might be significant. Let's start with the biblical foundation, because that's where all accurate prophetic understanding must begin. Before we can identify what the 7-year peace treaty is, we need to understand why it's so difficult to recognize. And that difficulty comes from 3 major challenges. First, there's the challenge of interpretation. Not all biblical scholars agree on how to read Daniel's prophecy. Some believe it's entirely future and literal. Others believe portions were fulfilled in the 1st century. And still others see it as symbolic rather than describing an actual political treaty. The dispensationalist view, which is probably the most common among evangelical Christians, sees this as a future 7-year period, a literal treaty made between the Antichrist and Israel that kicks off the final tribulation. But the preterist view argues this was fulfilled when Roman General Titus destroyed Jerusalem in AD 70. And the idealist perspective sees it as a spiritual principle rather than a specific event. So right from the start, we are dealing with legitimate theological disagreement among sincere Bible scholars. And that's important to acknowledge because humility is essential when studying prophecy. Second, There's the challenge of current events. The Middle East has been a hotbed of conflict and peace negotiations for decades. Every time a new agreement is proposed, prophecy watchers naturally ask, could this be it? The Camp David Accords in 1978 brought peace between Israel and Egypt. Many wondered if this was the fulfillment, but it wasn't a 7-year agreement, and it didn't involve the key elements Daniel described. The Oslo Accords in 1993 created a framework for Israeli-Palestinian peace. Again, prophecy students examined it closely, but it lacked the specific duration and the parties Daniel mentioned. More recently, the Abraham Accords normalized relations between Israel and several Arab nations. This was significant because it involved multiple nations, which fits the phrase covenant with many in Daniel's prophecy. But again, it wasn't structured as a 7-year agreement. This pattern has created what we might call prophecy fatigue. People hear that every new agreement might be the one, and when it isn't, they become skeptical of the whole concept. Third, there's the challenge of discernment. How do we watch for prophetic fulfillment without becoming date-setters or fear-mongers? Jesus himself told us to watch and be ready, but he also warned against those who claim to know times and dates. So we're walking a careful line. We want to be informed and aware. We want to understand biblical prophecy, but we don't want to fall into the trap of sensationalism or panic. The question is, can we identify specific biblical criteria that would need to be met? Can we know what we're actually looking for without speculating about things Scripture doesn't clearly reveal? The answer is yes. And that's where we need to turn to the text of Daniel itself to see what God has actually revealed about this covenant. He will confirm a covenant with many for 1/7. In the middle of the 7, he will put an end to sacrifice and offering. And at the temple, he will set up an abomination that causes desolation, until the end that is decreed is poured out on him. Now, that verse is packed with prophetic detail, but it only makes sense in the context of the entire passage. So let's back up to verse 24, where this prophecy begins. Daniel chapter 9:24 says, 77s are decreed for your people and your holy city. The word sevens here refers to periods of 7 years. So 70 weeks of years equals 490 years total. This entire prophecy covers a 490-year timeline, though not necessarily continuous. Verses 25 and 26 describe the first 69 weeks, that's 483 years. The prophecy says this period would begin with a decree to rebuild Jerusalem and end with the Messiah being cut off, a reference to Christ's crucifixion. And historically, this timeline fits remarkably well with the period from the decree of Artaxerxes in 445 BC to the crucifixion of Jesus in approximately AD 33. This is important because the first 69 weeks have already been fulfilled with stunning accuracy. That gives us confidence that the final week, the 70th 7, is also literal and specific. But notice there's a gap. Between the 69th week and the 70th week, there's a period not mentioned in Daniel's vision. Many scholars believe this gap represents the church age, the time we're living in now. The prophetic clock stopped when Israel rejected their Messiah and will restart when this 7-year covenant is confirmed. Now, back to verse 27. He will confirm a covenant with many for 1/7. Who is he? Looking at verse 26, the immediate antecedent is the ruler who will come, whose people destroyed Jerusalem in AD 70. That was the Romans. So this points to a future Roman leader, what the New Testament calls the Antichrist, who will make a 7-year covenant. The word confirm in Hebrew is gabar, which means to strengthen or make strong. Some translations say, make a covenant. But the Hebrew suggests strengthening or confirming an existing agreement. This could mean he reinforces a prior treaty or makes a weak agreement strong through his involvement. With many indicates multiple parties, not just a bilateral agreement between two nations, but a multilateral treaty involving several parties. This is why the Abraham Accords caught attention. Multiple nations normalizing relations with Israel fits this many description. For 1/7 is clear, 7 years, not 7 months or 7 decades. Biblical prophecy uses years as the standard measurement, and the context of the 70 weeks makes this unmistakable. We're looking for a 7-year duration. Now here's the critical part. In the middle of the 7, he will put an end to sacrifice and offering. The middle of 7 years is 3.5 years. 42 months, 1,260 days. This number appears repeatedly in prophetic scripture, Daniel, Revelation, and Jesus' teaching in Matthew 24. It's the midpoint of the tribulation when everything changes. For sacrifices to be stopped, they must first be happening. This implies that the Jewish temple will be rebuilt and temple worship restored. Right now, there's no temple in Jerusalem. But for this prophecy to be fulfilled, temple worship must be reinstituted, then halted at the midpoint. The phrase, "abomination that causes desolation," Jesus directly referenced in Matthew 24:15. He told his disciples that when they see this event, they should flee immediately, because great tribulation would follow. This is a specific, identifiable moment when the Antichrist desecrates the temple. Revelation 13 provides additional detail. At the midpoint, this leader will exalt himself, demand worship, and persecute those who refuse. The second half of the 7 years becomes a time of intense persecution. Now let's cross-reference this with other scriptures. 2 Thessalonians 2:3-4 talks about the man of lawlessness being revealed and setting himself up in God's temple, proclaiming himself to be God. This aligns perfectly with Daniel's midpoint event. Revelation 11 and 12 both reference a period of 1,160 days or 42 months when God's people are protected and persecuted. Again, this is the second half of the 7 years. So here's what we know from Scripture. We're looking for a 7-year covenant involving Israel and multiple nations, brokered or confirmed by a coming world leader. At the 3.5-year mark, this leader will break the covenant, stop temple sacrifices, desecrate the temple, and demand worship. This triggers the Great Tribulation, which lasts another 3.5 years until Christ returns. That's the biblical framework. Those are the specific elements that must be present for a treaty to qualify as the 7-year covenant of Daniel 9:27. First, let's clarify the covenant versus treaty distinction. In modern political language, we talk about treaties, agreements, and accords. But the biblical word is covenant, berith in Hebrew. This carries deeper meaning than a simple political arrangement. A covenant in biblical terms is a solemn, binding agreement, often with religious or sacred implications. This suggests the 7-year agreement won't just be a political peace treaty. It will likely have religious components, possibly involving temple worship rites, Jerusalem's sacred sites, or interfaith cooperation. The Abraham Accords, interestingly, included provisions for interfaith dialogue and religious site access, elements previous agreements lacked. Second, we need to understand the role of the key figure. Daniel says he will confirm the covenant. This leader isn't necessarily creating peace from scratch. He's strengthening or guaranteeing an existing framework. Think of it as a powerful international figure who brokers or enforces an agreement that others have struggled to maintain. What kind of leader could do this? Someone with significant international influence. Someone trusted by multiple parties. someone with authority to guarantee security and enforce terms. The biblical descriptions suggest this person rises to prominence through peace, not initially through war. Third, let's examine the current geopolitical landscape and why it's unique in history. For the first time since AD 70, Israel exists as a nation. This is fundamental. Daniel's prophecy requires Israel to be a nation capable of making covenants, and that only became possible again in 1948. Additionally, for the first time in history, multiple Arab nations are normalizing relations with Israel. The Abraham Accords created diplomatic relationships that were unthinkable a generation ago. Saudi Arabia is openly discussing normalization. Regional dynamics are shifting dramatically. The temple question is also evolving. For decades, rebuilding the temple seemed impossible. The Dome of the Rock sits on the Temple Mount. But recent archaeological and political discussions have explored scenarios where both could theoretically coexist. The Temple Institute in Jerusalem has prepared temple implements, trained priests, and created architectural plans. What seemed impossible is becoming conceivable. Technology also plays a role that previous generations couldn't imagine. Revelation 13 describes a system where the Antichrist controls all commerce. No one can buy or sell without his mark. For centuries, this seemed metaphorical. How could one person control global commerce? But today, we have digital currencies, biometric identification, and centralized financial systems that make such control technically feasible. We're not saying current technology is the mark, but we're noting that prophecies once thought impossible are now technologically plausible. Fourth, let's address the timeline question honestly. We don't know when this covenant will be confirmed. Jesus explicitly said no one knows the day or hour. Setting dates is both foolish and unbiblical. However, and this is important, Jesus also rebuked the religious leaders for not recognizing the signs of the times. In Matthew chapter 16:3, he said they could predict the weather, but couldn't discern the prophetic season. We're called to watch, to be aware, to understand the times without becoming date setters. So what should we be watching for? A 7-year agreement, specifically. Not a 5-year plan or an indefinite framework, but a covenant structured for 7 years. Involvement of Israel and multiple nations, a prominent international figure brokering or guaranteeing it. Provisions that would allow for temple worship, because sacrifices must be happening for them to be stopped at the midpoint. When all these elements converge, a 7-year duration, multiple parties, Israel at the center, temple implications, and a guaranteeing leader, then we'll have strong reason to believe we're witnessing Daniel's prophecy beginning to unfold. But until all these specific criteria are met, we should be cautious about declaring any particular agreement as the one. Discernment requires patience and precision, not sensationalism. So here's where everything we've discussed converges. Why is this moment in history potentially significant? Not because we're date-setting, but because multiple prophetic prerequisites are aligning in ways they never have before. Let me give you the most compelling argument for why we should be paying attention right now. For 1,178 years, from AD 70 until 1948, this prophecy couldn't possibly be fulfilled because Israel didn't exist as a nation. Daniel's covenant requires Israel as a treaty partner. That prerequisite was impossible for nearly 2 millennia. But since 1948, it's been possible. That's factor 1. Israel exists. Factor 2. Jerusalem is under Israeli control. In 1967, for the first time since the Babylonian exile, Jerusalem came under Jewish sovereignty. Jesus said in Luke 21:24 that Jerusalem will be trampled on by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. The Six-Day War changed Jerusalem's status fundamentally. Factor 3. Multiple Arab nations are willing to normalize with Israel. The Abraham Accords normalized relations with the UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan. Saudi Arabia is discussing normalization. This creates the many that Daniel referenced, multiple parties willing to enter covenant relationships. Factor 4. The temple movement is organized and prepared. The Temple Institute has created the implements, trained the priests, bred the red heifer, and developed architectural plans. What seemed impossible a generation ago is now systematically prepared. Factor 5. Technology exists to enable global control systems. Digital currencies, biometric identification, centralized financial networks. The infrastructure for the Mark system described in Revelation 13 is being built right now. Previous generations couldn't fulfill this prophecy because the technology didn't exist. Factor 6. Global governance are forming. International bodies, regional alliances, and supranational organizations create the framework for a world leader to emerge with genuine authority over multiple nations. The European Union, the United Nations, various international coalitions. These create possibilities that didn't exist in previous centuries. Now, does any of this mean the 7-year covenant will be confirmed tomorrow? No. Does it mean we're definitely in the last days? We can't be dogmatic. But it does mean that for the first time in history, all the prerequisite conditions are simultaneously present. Biblical scholars from previous centuries could study Daniel's prophecy, but they couldn't imagine how it would be fulfilled because Israel didn't exist. Jerusalem wasn't under Jewish control, and the technology for global governance didn't exist. We're the first generation in 2,000 years where every single element is not just possible, but visibly developing. That doesn't mean we panic. It doesn't mean we abandon our responsibilities or become date-setters, but it does mean we should watch with wisdom, understanding the times, and living with eternal perspective. Because if these are indeed the days the prophets wrote about, then our generation may witness the fulfillment of prophecies that believers have longed to see for 2,000 years. Let's bring everything together. We've covered a lot of ground today, so here's what you need to remember. The 7-year peace treaty comes from Daniel 9:27, a specific prophecy describing a covenant confirmed with Israel and many nations for exactly 7 years. At the midpoint, this covenant will be broken, temple sacrifices will stop, and the Great Tribulation will begin. This isn't symbolic. It's not metaphorical. The first 69 weeks of Daniel's prophecy were fulfilled literally and precisely. We should expect the 70th week to be fulfilled the same way. We've seen why previous peace agreements, Camp David, Oslo, Abraham Accords, didn't qualify. They lacked the 7-year duration, the right parties, or the temple implications that Scripture requires. But we've also seen why this current moment in history is unique. Israel exists. Jerusalem is under Jewish control. Multiple nations are normalizing with Israel. Temple preparations are underway. Technology enables global control systems. All the prerequisites are present simultaneously for the first time in 2,000 years. Does this mean the covenant will be confirmed soon? We don't know. God hasn't revealed the timing, but we are called to watch, to understand the times, and to be ready. The purpose of prophecy isn't to make us fearful. It's to make us faithful, to live with urgency, to share the gospel while there's time, to look up because our redemption draws near. I want to hear your perspective. Which theological view makes the most sense to you? Futurist, preterist, or idealist? And what current developments do you think are most significant? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this study helpful, check out my previous video on the timing of the rapture and how it relates to the 7-year timeline. It's a crucial piece of understanding the complete prophetic framework. Subscribe for more biblical prophecy teaching. Because next week we're exploring what happens at the midpoint, the abomination of desolation. What exactly is it? How will we recognize it? And what does Jesus tell us to do when we see it? But there's something I didn't mention today. A detail in Daniel chapter 9:27 that most people overlook. It changes everything about how we identify.